Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a shallow cave in an endless desert, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, our scene opens in the great, vast frontier of space. Although not for long, as you'll see. It occurs to me that not many of our stories take place off-planet. It's easier to keep you awake at night if the horror takes place close to home, in your own neighborhood, or in your own bedroom. But, with that said, you'll find no shortage of horror here, and never any respite from it either. This story is called Shifting Sands and was written by A.G. Hilton. Her world exploded in flashing lights racing across the instrument panels, alarms blaring in her ears, a sickening tilt in her stomach as the artificial gravity faltered and the ship tilted wildly. All the while, her head pounded as a familiar pain lodged like shrapnel in her brain. They were going to crash. Sheila knew this as surely as anything, and yet even in the chaos, a part of her mind calmly asked, why? She remembered no foreign object collisions, no bombardments, no indications of imminent system failure. And yet, they were going to crash. No, no, no! Shepard's hands flew over the controls wildly. Nothing's responsive. It's like we hit some kind of EMP field or techno-shielding, but the sensors didn't even chirp. Sheila fought with her own control module, but to no avail. The ship plummeted planet-side in a ball of white heat. The two of them scrambled wordlessly to secure themselves, each accepting the inevitability of the next moments and bracing for the impact. Shepard offered his hand across the center console. Sheila took it, squeezed, and closed her eyes. For a time, there was darkness. Then it came to her, a blaring, incessantly annoying sound. She moaned and batted a hand as if trying to silence a morning alarm. Then the pain settled into her body, bringing with it total clarity. I'm alive. Joy lifted her in elation over her continued existence, which for a time blotted out all else. Then she became aware of the blaring sound once more. Eyes darting to the feebly illuminated readouts on her screen, her joy in survival fell away. The fuel cells had ruptured. If a single spark contacted the fuel residue, she knew that her surviving the crash would be inconsequential. Shepard, we gotta move! Shepard did not heed her. Struggling to be free from her safety harness, she called his name again. Shepard sat limply in his seat, his head at an odd angle. She disengaged herself from her own safety restraints and flew to her partner's side. Working quickly but carefully, she pulled him free of his own harnesses and laid him as gently as she could on the floor. Scrambling past him toward the back of the vessel, a numbness and sickening nausea washed over her. This whole thing was a dream. Had to be. It was a familiar but terrible nightmare from which she would soon awake. However, no sooner had the thought occurred, the full and horrible reality of the predicament set in with a glance at the respirator suits. They lay thrown about their storage compartment, visors smashed, material torn and useless. Seeing no other option, she went to the hatch. The controls were down, but the manual safety lock seemed to be intact, and with great effort she managed to throw it open expecting choking gases or fierce frozen winds to decide her fate before the fuel cell explosion. But neither came. Heat wafted in on her, bringing with it coarse sand and dry but breathable air. She took only a moment to reflect on this bit of blind luck before rushing back to the ship's pilot cabin and the limp Shepard. Grasping him under his arms, she hauled him back through the ship, heedless of the still blaring alarms from the controls. She dragged him through the hatch and deposited him on a sand dune beside the wreckage. That accomplished, she made one more foray into the ship, hauling out a black case and a duffel bag, both of which she lay beside her partner. "Shepard! Shepard, come on!" She patted his face lightly, with no response. Hesitantly, she reached for his throat with 2 fingers, but the way his head lolled in response to her touch confirmed her fears before she felt the absence of the rhythmic pulse. Shepard was gone. The sting of tears came immediately, but her desire to mourn clashed with her survival drive and its blaring alarms inside her skull. Through blurred vision, she took stock of the situation. The land around her lay barren, a repetition of dune upon dune as far as she could see. Aside from a rocky outcropping in the distance, the world was a swirl of whiteness under an empty and cloudless sky. She looked at the duffel bag and the long black case retrieved from the wreckage. She had enough rations to last for a few weeks, and the small evaporative unit could draw out the water supply a little longer, given there was any moisture to be drawn out of the air. The disassembled plasma rifle might just weigh her down. Another look at her surroundings told her that game, likely life in general, would be sparse to non-existent in this dead place. Then she saw something, a glint, which flashed against a rocky outcropping in the distance. Training reflex brought her to the ground beside Shepard's body. She recognized the glint instantly, the reflection of a rifle scope. Perhaps the planet was not as dead as it seemed. Perhaps whoever had disabled the ship had come to clean up. She tried to remain cool-headed, but the panic expanded in her chest with each thump of her heart. She knew how exposed she was, that it would be nothing for an average marksman to pick her off. She thought of her own rifle, knew that she would not have time to remove and assemble the components. An acrid smell in the air reminded her of the fuel cells. Then her eyes found Shepard's. The eyelids had parted as she had moved him, and the whiteness of the uprolled eyes beneath looked back at her emptily. Panic ignited fear, and Shelia snatched up the bag and the black case, heedless of the possible sniper on the ridge, and plunged away over the nearest sand dune. Shelia didn't know how much time had passed before the ensuing explosion of the wreckage sent a gust of acrid wind blowing over her. Her flight had been a thing of pure instinct. Wildly, she plunged across the yielding sands as her calves screamed with the strain, until at last she had collapsed against a monstrous dune, shaking uncontrollably. She'd thought she'd heard a scream, a mournful howl carried on the wind just before the detonation of the wreckage, but she could not be sure. For a time, she could only lay there. She had had the awareness to throw a blanket from the survival kit over herself to protect against the beams which beat relentlessly down, yet already she felt the beginnings of sunburn on her face and hands. But these things were distant. Her mind was elsewhere. In her thoughts, she was still with Shepard. They were returning from their reconnaissance mission, primed for leave, and she was bursting with good news. "Once we land," she told herself, "once we land, I'll tell Shepard he's going to be a father." She allowed the tears at last, and as they spilled down either side of her reddened face, she could not be bothered about the waste of moisture. Food would not be a problem. The condensed nutrient packs in the survival kit could sustain her for months, possibly longer. Of primary concern was the water. She had enough to hold her over a period of weeks if she conserved it, but the portable evaporator proved unable to draw much moisture from the air. Survival seemed more and more a lonely and pointless game, the conclusion of which might be brought about sooner using the plasma rifle. But she wouldn't let herself give in so easily. It was not just her life at stake. She allowed her mind to focus on the one hope that remained, no matter how remote its likelihood. She knew that the ship's last coordinates would have been broadcasting even as the crash occurred. As soon as the core outpost stopped receiving the transmission, they would dispatch a recovery team. But how long it would take for a ship to reach her, she could only guess. Sheila assembled the plasma rifle at last. Her fear of the possible hostile presence had been rekindled, and she thought she sometimes glimpsed a solitary figure following her. Sometimes there even appeared to be one ahead of her. Although at this point a run-in with anything, even a Scree war party, would have been a welcome change of pace from the stillness. But these were merely hallucinations, combinations of mirages and her heat-exhausted mind, which she knew was beginning to come unraveled. There was no way to tell how long she'd wandered or how far. The desert continued in a limitless expanse of ever-shifting geography. Hot winds stirred the sands, filling in footprints as she went, covering up any telltale tracks before her, and constantly remolding her surroundings. Once, she waited and watched as a section of dune seemed to break away, only to reform seemingly exactly as it had been minutes later. Her disorientation was worsened by the perpetual sunlight, for the planet seemed to rotate in an incredibly slow manner, almost as if not at all. The whole world seemed unstable, unstuck from any points of reference that would denote the passage of time or the accumulation of progress. Her existence spiraled into a maddening swirl of heat-stricken déjà vu under a perpetual sun, and she wondered if she was beginning to feel the same grinding erosion of sanity which took those crews unfortunate enough to become stranded in the deep midnight between stars. Eventually, not knowing how long this world's days would stretch, she gave up on the notion of being able to wait for nightfall to travel and struck out in search of any shelter that might protect her from further heat exposure. At length, she stumbled upon a lone change amid the sea of white, a rocky crag. She climbed within its recesses onto mercifully cool stone. Sickness rolled within her belly. Her head felt as though it had been staved in with a hammer. Greedily, she drank some of her water. It stung her cracking lips, but felt like life springing within her. At once, the exhaustion closed in on her, and her eyelids became leaden weights. In those moments before sleep, she imagined that she saw things clearly. This was just a nightmare. When she woke, Shepard would be fine. They would be en route to their rendezvous, and all of this would be but a dream. How long she lay there she could not tell, but when she woke in a daze, the sunlight radiated just as strong as it had when she took shelter. Outside, the wind continued to break down and reform the land about her. "I'm in hell," she thought wildly. "Maybe I died in the crash, or maybe we crashed into hell itself." Something in the thought struck her as funny in its absurd aptness, and giggles rose up in her from some empty and resigned place. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle them, slamming the door on their source. They came from a place of delirium and dementia from which she feared she may never return if the door were ever allowed to fully open. For, by now, she felt an isolation as she could have never fathomed before this barren waste. It was as though she had come unstuck in time. Her days spiraled into endless repetitions of the same natural cycles, her nights into maddening dreams of the crash, of flight through the desert. Sometimes, when the sun seemed to beam its hottest, she thought she saw figures coming toward her. As heat rose from the dune ridges, she saw them, one following the other, seeming to stretch to an infinitely distant point. Yet, she would not allow her mind to break. Whatever would happen, she would see it through, or else decide an ending on her own terms. This world, with its unending bleakness and despair, had become an enemy more personal than any she had faced for the core, and she would not let it win. Beside her sat her bag of supplies. It was nearly empty. The roaring tore into Shelia's nightmare of once more plummeting to the hot sands, and in waking she felt sick and disoriented. She sat and listened, thinking at first that it was just the endless wind finding some new crevice in the rocks. But it persisted, and what once was a sound carried by the wind seemed to grow louder and more concrete. Wrapped in her blanket, she leaned out into the heat and gasped as she saw a light arc against the blue sky. A transport descended rapidly through the atmosphere. Shouting and waving, she watched as it came on, streaming a thin line of smoke behind it. Only after pausing to watch the ship's descent did she see that it was wrong. She knew from the speed at which the craft approached that it was no longer under the control of the pilot. "No," her unused voice came as a hoarse croak, the grinding of sand on rock. "Stop it! Stop it!" The ship streaked downward, now arcing her direction. She screamed at it incoherently, willing it to right itself, to settle gently into the sands. Meanwhile, it tore above her head, and when she heard the thump and felt the reverberations through her feet, she knew it was too late. Gathering her things, she cursed her hopefulness. How could she imagine that her rescuers would be free from whatever disabled her own ship? Still, the fierce and animal survivor which had taken charge in her coldly calculated the possibilities of further rations and survivors. She would live. She would live yet, and there would be another transport. Climbing atop the rocky crag, she saw a thin line of smoke twisting in the wind. At its base, only a dot, she could see the wreckage. Scrambling back down, she retrieved her rifle and used its scope to survey the scene. A scout ship, from the looks of it, like the kind she had once flown with Shepard. She could only look for a moment. The brightness of the land magnified through the scope made her head spin, but the ship looked intact enough that someone may have survived. In the very least, food stores may be salvageable. Then she was plodding toward the site, eyes ever fixed on the coiling smoke. As the ship came into view, her mind flew back to the crash, to Shepard's lifeless eyes gazing into her own. As if conjured by the thought, she saw a form lying nearby, face down in the sand. She ran to the crewman's side, but stopped within a few yards of him and fell to her knees. The crewman stared at her with half-opened eyes, the whiteness of the up-rolled orbs burning into her mind with sickening recognition. But it couldn't be. She rushed the body, grabbed it and shook it so that it flopped limply. There, on its chest, was the undeniable evidence, a name tag, reading J. Shepard. "I've broken," The thought came in a voice of hideous laughter from beyond the door of madness. So this is what it feels like to be lost within oneself. Then another voice, shouting, trying to drown out the voice of the laughter. It's a dream! All a dream! It must be a dream! Please, God, let it be a dream! But when she ran to the ship, saw the state of the wreckage, felt its metal against her skin, she could not deny the reality of it. She fell to her knees and looked over her shoulder to see tracks leading away from the detritus and over the nearest sand dune just before the wind blew them away. And in one horrible moment, she knew who had just fled across the desert. She screamed. The fuel cells ignited. Once again, her world explodes into flashing lights racing across the instrument panels. Alarms blaring wildly. A sickening tilt fills her stomach as the artificial gravity falters and the ship tilts wildly. All the while, her head pounds as a familiar pain lodges like shrapnel in her brain. Ooh. The ending to that story makes me feel all anxious and full of dread. I love it. I read somewhere once that the gods are jealous of humankind because humans can die, while the immortals cannot. That idea seemed crazy at the time. Who wouldn't want to be rid of the fear of death? But this story reminds me that on a long enough scale, immortality would become absolutely insufferable. And imagine if, like in this story, you were trapped in a small window of time full of suffering and strife, only to realize in the end there never was any hope, and you would be doomed to repeat the process over and over and over and over. Ugh, there go those shivers again. Usually, I frighten you with monsters and things that go bump in the night. But tonight, we really ratcheted the terror up to an existential level. If you enjoyed this story, please check out the author, A.G. Hilton, in the links below. He has several other books available now, and an audiobook narrated by your very own Midnight Host. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Whatever you do, try not to get bogged down in an existential crisis. And don't fall asleep.